Psychological safety. Psychological safety is a term that I've known about for a while, but it's something that I haven't really applied in a learning, teaching context online. So, psychological safety is a term I came across in my undergraduate degree, and it was something essentially when you're in a coaching context, you're out and about. My context specifically was mainly in football, and you'd need it to be psychologically safe, meaning people are okay taking risks. They feel safe enough to take risks and not get picked on, not get bullied, not get shouted at or laughed at or anything like that. That's a very obvious example of what psychological safety could look like. It's an environment where individuals they feel safe enough to make mistakes, to try new things, and know that there isn't going to be, not judgment, because judgment everyone judges, but a result that could be an action, a result that could be perceived as negative or could be perceived as damaging. And when we think about all of the stuff that's going on with mental health, psychological safety is really important. Now, psychological safety has been applied not just in the sporting context, it's also been applied in the business context, team context, and what I want to do is explore psychological safety and how different learning and teaching in different environments can actually use this, and all of the references that I will be talking about in this podcast will be in links below, so I will leave a link in the footnotes in the description, what's it called? Yeah, they will be there, so you can have a look at the resources. But this first one that I got psychological safety from again that reminded me this week was from the Sports Psych Show with Mustafa Sarkar. I have no idea how you say that name. I apologise. They're both on Twitter, but it was a great conversation. They were talking about psychological safety in teams, groups, communities, and taking risks. Now, where I want to go with this conversation is online psychological safety, because most people, when they think, oh, online, it's unsafe because of all the judgments that people have, the trolls that are out there, and yes, there are lots of people out there that want to not necessarily hurt people, but damage or just be annoying, think they're funny, but they're not, and it doesn't create safe environments sometimes. But having said that, that is a very small minority of most of the people that are online, because most people online don't actually comment. They don't engage in conversation. They don't get involved in conversations. So when you see a video that's got, I don't know, 1 million views, you may see 1,000 comments, and maybe 10 or 20 of those comments on average are not so nice comments, which could be challenging the psychological safety of the environment, which is the video context. But other channels, Veritasium is a channel, Smarter Every Day, the Smart Get Smarter Every Day YouTube channel. Both of those channels are examples in my mind where all the comment sections are there. Some of them are experts in the field that are looking to critique whatever's gone on the video. Other people are just genuine people that are interested. Basically, all of the things that Hank Green and the Green Brothers are involved in, so that's Crash Course, SciShow, all the different SciShow channels, Vlog Brothers, all of their comment sections are really, really nice. They're really friendly. There is a psychological safe environment to make a comment. You can engage in the community, engage in the conversation without sort of fear of being judged. You're going to get judged, but not being pounced upon by trolls, and that it's a safe environment. And if this is what I've seen in some of those comment sections, if people do jump on and say you're wrong, this is rubbish, and start challenging people, not necessarily in a negative way. So you can challenge people, don't get me wrong. Challenging people is how we move forwards. But it's not, oh, you're wrong, I'm right, you're silly, and then start throwing insults. If that does happen in some of those comment sections, other people support whatever the original person was. They try and help that person through. It's not a, you're wrong, I'm going to laugh at you in the corner type thing. It's a, okay, this is your opinion, this is your belief right now, this is what we currently know, and you basically, all the comment sections start become teachers. We start helping each other out, which is essentially what Wikipedia is. All of the editors on Wikipedia are the same sort of thing, and this is where I'm sort of starting to move with some of my personal explorations and sharing of information is through Wikipedia, because in YouTube comments it's great, but YouTube comments get lost very, very quickly, and there are some amazing, absolutely amazing conversations going on in YouTube comments, but you never see them because they're like 10 scrolls down and you have to open up the comment section, and it's those conversations that are hidden hidden away that when you're in conferences, they're the sort of conversations you want to have. Maybe you don't go to conferences, and obviously during COVID we haven't been able to go to conferences, but when you go to a conference, you have all the conversations, the talks when they're on stage, but it's the conversations after stage. So when they come off stage and you ask them a question and you hear those conversations, it's not necessarily you, it's just someone asking a question like, I really don't get this thing, can you just explain it to me in a different way, so I can really visualize and get a deeper understanding of what is going on. And those conversations, because the environment is a conference, and the conference is positioned most of the time in a way that creates an element of psychological safety, people can just ask those questions. Now, sometimes people don't ask those questions in the broad thing, so when everyone's listening to the speaker, some people don't ask questions, they want to ask the question to that person, but that's because there's a slight different elements involved. There's individual confidence from the person asking the question, so they don't feel safe because of potential insecurities for them, or potentially they don't think that the question would be useful for other people. And there's loads of different aspects that can impact why people ask questions. That's something different, but they feel safe enough to ask the question to one person, to that person. So that person has created an environment around themselves to be psychologically safe. And that could be a coach, that could be a teacher, that could be a lecturer, that could be someone making a YouTube video. If you're making a YouTube video and you are the creator of the video, and the people can see in the comment section that you say, oh, you're stupid, and they ridicule people that are commenting, well, people are less likely to comment because you haven't created, or the creator won't have created, a psychologically safe environment in the comment section. So that is what I try and do in my channel, and I'm trying to do here. Like, I will just try and what's the word, because I'm not teaching or coaching in the comment section, it's trying to trigger thought, trigger curiosity, and just explore, basically encourage science, encourage scientific thinking in the comment section. Now, expanding this out forwards, there are lots of things that goes on in the learning and teaching and coaching environment, and psychological safety is just one element of it, and non-linear pedagogy is something that I'm very, very familiar with, but it was brought up again on the Perception Action podcast, which is about perception and action, mainly skill acquisition in sport. But non-linear and linear pedagogy are things that aren't necessarily spoken about on StudyTube. The YouTube that talk about wow, that was great English. YouTube channels that speak about learning, speak about teaching, a lot of them that are popular anyway, speak about linear pedagogy, linear processes in learning, which is great, it's fine. There are certain contexts where that works, but there are certain contexts where it doesn't work. And the direction I want to take this is where the context can shift. So linear pedagogy suggests there is one output, i.e. there is one answer. So when you're doing a test, I'm going to use some examples. These aren't just sole examples, and I'm not trying to pick on them. These are just examples to give you a bit of visualization. Doctor tests. Like when you're doing a medical test, this is my understanding, the majority of the tests have an answer. There is an answer to the question, which is that there is one output. Then there is predictable results. So when you have a case study, there are predictable results. You know that this person with this symptoms are likely to have potentially one of these things, so you could diagnose the issue. So there are predictable results that aren't impacted by loads of other things. It is just, these are the symptoms I have been told, this is a predictable result I'm going to get, and this is the answer to the question from all of these symptoms. It's a very linear process in learning. Then the last main part of linear pedagogy, I did have to write these down because otherwise I'd spend my time going around in my head, is parts to add up to the whole. So again, using those symptoms, you have lots of different symptoms that are different parts, and when you put them together, you get a whole, you get an answer. Most of the time, an answer. Yes, you could be incorrect because there could be another symptom, another part that you haven't found yet, or maybe maybe you've made some assumptions during that calculation to get to a result, to get to a diagnosis, but eventually, all of the parts will add up to a whole. In non-linear pedagogy, those things don't quite work, so there's more than one output. Non-linear pedagogy is traditionally seen in sport, but it's also seen in most of psychological content, philosophical content, there is more than one answer. There's more than one output. For example, when you kick a football, you can kick a football in a lot of different ways, and there can be lots of different outputs dependent on other things. The most obvious example that I'm going to use here is the wind. If you kick a football forwards and the wind is coming towards you, you know the ball is going to go backwards. Eventually, if the wind is heavy enough. If you kick a football and the wind's going left, then the ball's going to go left, or it could go right, and you can't control any of that. So you can make an action, you can do something, you can learn how to do a skill, but the output is going to be slightly different. If there is someone in the way, again, slightly different. If there is someone affecting what you want to do, so there is a defender running at you and you kick a football, well, kicking the football is the action, but now there's lots of different things that you need to consider. So there's going to be more than one output. Maybe you need to kick it with the side foot to go one way, kick it with the laces, kick it with a different part of the foot. Now, yes, they are different skills, but they're essentially the same learning. It's the same element of learning, but there are different ways to do it with different outputs. I don't think that's a great way to explain it, but it's the best way I can come up with at the moment. So I would highly suggest having a look at what's his name, Rob Gray's podcast. Have a listen to that, because he explains it much better than me, because that's his field of expertise. My field of expertise is not in explaining skill acquisition. But that's just one example. Then there are interactions can change results, which I kind of alluded to there. So with linear pedagogy, there is an answer, whereas in non-linear pedagogy, there is an answer, but it can be impacted by other things. Maybe that was what I was explaining, rather than the more than one output, because, like I say, the wind, other people getting in the way, other objects, maybe changing the objects, changing the environment. There are things that are going to change the output, because you have to learn sort of on the fly almost. Trampoline is an interesting example, because that's my sport, trampoline. There is a trampoline, and the trampoline, you would have thought, doesn't change, but it does. So when you learn a skill, say you learn a front somersault, where you go from your feet 360 degrees forwards over your head, and then you land on your feet again. A front flip, for those of you that love garden trampolining. If you do a front flip on a trampoline, that's great. You've learned the skill. But if you go on a different trampoline, you have to relearn the skill, because it could be a bouncier trampoline, or a less bouncy trampoline, or it could be a bigger trampoline, or a smaller trampoline, and that skill suddenly has to be relearned. Then if you take it off a trampoline, you put it on the floor, it's now a different skill, because you've drastically changed the environment, and you've changed the affordances of the environment because of the constraints you've put in. So all of those things then change how you learn, what you learn, and it just changes the environment. And something else to make it even more complicated is when you're on a trampoline doing a somersault. If you're slightly in front of the cross, the trampoline is going to push you backwards because of physics, and if you do a front somersault slightly forwards, it's going to push you backwards, so you may need to change your trajectory going upwards so that you don't fall off the trampoline going backwards. But if you start your somersault slightly behind the cross, slightly behind the middle of the trampoline is going to push you forwards. So again, you may want to change your trajectory going up so you don't go off the trampoline. But where you take off the somersault is going to differ almost every single time, because your feet might be slightly apart, you might be slightly forward, slightly backwards, you might have landed slightly left heavy, slightly right heavy, and you have to work out every single time you do the somersault how much rotation you put in, where you put the rotation in, where you do all of the rest of the stuff that you would do in a trampoline skill. So in the front somersault, you'd need to line out, where you line out, how you do the twist, how you do the rotation, where you push different parts of the body. All of that is going to change almost every time you do the skill, and you have to work it out. It's not something you know, yep, I've done this, I now know this thing, move on. Even elite trampolinists that are in the Olympics will mess up front somersaults because of different things that have been put into the environment. Whereas in linear pedagogic environments, once you know the answer, that's it. You know the answer. It's a fairly well-known fact. It's backed up by research. You have a belief. It's trustworthy. It's justifiable. Whereas in non-linear pedagogy, yes, there might be biomechanical reasons for you to do A, B, C, D, but you still need to change things to actually get the output you want. Hopefully that has made sense, and I've explained that in a way that you can visualize some of the differences. And then the last bit, which is interesting to me, is parts do not add up to the whole. And when it comes to learning here, this is the learning aspect of non-linear pedagogy and pedagogy, non-linear and linear pedagogy, is when you're learning something that is, okay, this is the answer to the problem, There are different parts that you can add up to make the whole. There are different parts you can add up to get to the answer. But in non-linear pedagogy, you can have completely different parts and then add up to the whole that you're looking for. So, I'm passing a football. You could do a passing drill that's passing in straight lines, and then you say, okay, now I want you to put that in a game situation. Well, that's not going to work because of all the interactivity that is in a game situation. So breaking it down to a small skill doesn't actually help in some contexts building up to the whole, because there are more parts that need to be put in. There are more elements that need to be put in. There needs to be ecological validity. There needs to be opponents being brought in. So breaking it down into the parts doesn't always add up to the whole. And sometimes the whole can't actually be broken down because the whole is a context. It is something that is specific to that environment. So if it's a 2-on-1 environment, for example, when you're attacking, a 2-on-1 environment, when you recreate that, almost every single time you attack, there is going to be a completely different set of events, because defender may move forwards quicker or slower or to the left or to the right, and you don't know what the defenders are going to do. So breaking it down into parts is breaking it down into essentially an easier context when you're learning it. So parts don't always add up to the whole, because there are so many parts to consider that you just can't break it down. So you'd end up learning different skills that you can build up eventually to create this skill, eventually, this learnt thing as a whole. But again, every single time you do it, even the people in the Premier League, like playing football, like even them, they are breaking down every single time they try and defend, because if it's a new defender, they're going to defend in a different way. So they can use skills that they've built, but they have to use those skills in the environment. They have to read the environment, perception, action, and work out what they're going to do to get around this player, and then use all the other elements of their understanding of the game and sport to then try and succeed. Whereas in linear pedagogy, in linear contexts, you don't have to worry about any of that because there aren't any players running at you. It's not like in an exam you get someone going, okay, that's the question, you've answered that question, but now I'm going to change the question slightly, and then you have to re-answer the question, and then they change it again, and then they change it again, and then by the end of the test you've only answered that one question because they changed the question multiple times. Like that's the, I mean, there's a potentially a really crude example, but that's what I have in my head. You know, that just doesn't happen, which is the difference, I think, between linear and non-linear pedagogy. So when we are learning these things, when we are teaching how to learn these things, if the techniques that are being shared are all about linear pedagogy, what about the environments that have multiple contexts? Psychology. Psychology. Or I'm thinking like this, you're thinking like that. I perceive this, my belief is that. Well, how are you going to get an answer there? You're not really going to get an answer there, which makes it very, very complicated. It makes learning very, very complicated, which is why flashcards aren't the answer to a lot of different things when it comes to learning, but it's very, very popular. And flashcards are useful. Active recall is useful. Spaced repetition is useful, mainly for linear pedagogy. And a good example that I've seen recently spoken about this is Mode A and Mode B teaching. Now, I'm not a fan of it. There are certainly critiques that I have with it, but it's a great way to look at it for someone looking at it like as a first-time individual, or that doesn't have understanding of the sports coaching elements to teaching. And this comes from Tom Sheringham, and I believe he's a teacher. A teacher in primary schools, went around, did lots of different things from what I saw in the video, and essentially Mode A teaching is the traditional teaching of, I'm going to tell you this thing, I'm going to explain this thing to you, sort of stand at the front of the classroom and do the talking, and then they answer questions. That's more linear in teaching, because it's this is me telling you this thing, you have now learnt this thing, and we now carry on and we do the test. Mode B teaching is a little more non-linear because it's about exploration. It's testing things out, it's trying things, it's experiencing different things that may fail, may succeed, may work. Different elements can change the environment. There's interchangeability. There are interactions. I'm looking at the points of non-linear, and like, there's more than one output. Well, there certainly is, because if for example, this is something that I did at school in, I think it was a biology lesson. We went out onto a field, we put a square on the floor, and we tried to count how many flowers are in the square. Well, everyone's going to have a different square, so there's going to be different numbers. Maybe If you're counting bugs may move. You're like, okay, well, do I count the bugs that are in there to start with or at the end? And then when it comes to the parts do not add up to the whole, well, you could do an experiment in science, and you may have mixed something slightly wrong. Maybe you got the wrong ratio and just wasn't a result. Or maybe you mixed it slightly differently to the person next to you, and they got a really dark purple liquid and you got a really light purple liquid. I have no idea what test that would be, but it's just an experiment I remember doing. The experimentation is more non-linear because there's less predictable results. Like, yes, you may know what the result is, but you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and maybe you could change this thing. I mean, thinking about Einstein, they were doing all their tests. What if you change this? What if we change that? It's more non-linear in exploration. But that type of learning requires a little bit more from the teacher, because there needs to be constraints put in to allow them to learn something around what you actually want them to learn about. Because with experiments, you could learn so many different things. You could learn just how to do the experiment, and that could be the lesson. Or you could learn what the experiment is about. But you then need to put the constraints on to try and guide the learning, which is why nonlinear pedagogy is difficult, and which is why sports coaching is so hard to actually get. I don't want to say right, because there is no right way of doing it, but it's very difficult to be effective at sports coaching because it is all non-linear. There is almost no linear aspect to coaching sport, unless it's a very specific, like, directed sport. I'm trying to think of one right now, like darts maybe, because it's such a fixed environment. I guess darts would be the most linear in skill, but still, I mean, I would imagine it's going to change. It's going to be difficult, but I don't know enough about darts to explain that. But hopefully that sort of makes sense to you. And me exploring this as well, mode A and mode B teaching, there are traditional elements of learning, but in just like learn this thing ABC, but then there's also exploratory. Okay, let's have a look. And the exploratory aspects online, I think, are what they're not necessarily left out in the physics and the engineering stuff, because they do the experiments and they explain what could happen and where things go. But the content that I see that's actually about learning, just repeat, active recall, spaced repetition, and flashcards, and you're like, it's not quite working for all contexts. So I think a little bit of context needs to be put on some of those pieces of information that's shared. And I'm going to move over a little bit sideways and say this. I'm going to read this out. Am I answering the question you're asking? It was a question that I came up with during the week. Am I answering the question you're asking? So when people ask a question, they have a meaning behind the question. And when you answer the question, you have a meaning behind the question as well. So you could be answering the question that you have. You could be answering the question that you think they asked, not the question that they think they asked. And when you're trying to answer a question that is being asked online, or trying to answer something that you've seen in a video or seen in a blog or heard in a lecture or heard in a conversation, when you hear that, there is a perception, there is a thing that you have in your mind what that means, and then you try and answer from your knowledge what that means to you. Now, if you and the teacher or the individual or the conversation think the question means something else, you may answer wrong because they have a different question in mind. So you need to make sure that whatever answer you give to the question is actually answering the question that they mean for it to be. Hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, let me know through Twitter or whatever, and I'll try and explain that in a different way. But essentially, when you get a question, or you hear a question, you hear a conversation, you think, okay, I don't agree with that. Is that you don't agree with what's been said, or you have a different meaning of the question that's potentially been asked, or the statement that's potentially been made, which requires, therefore, a little bit of thinking, like, okay, why did they say that? What do I think their perception is of this thing? And where can we go with that? And obviously this is massively influenced by communication. The individual that is starting this communication, I think, should try and be as clear as possible when explaining something as a topic or as a question or any sort of learning context, which is what I try and do. I try and explain the context that I'm speaking in so that the meaning behind the question, the meaning behind the statements aren't confused as much, but I know it's still going to happen. So taking this a little bit further, there's a paper from Derek Muller, the guy that runs Veritasium, which he did as part of his PhD. Yeah, and his part of his PhD, the title of the paper is "Saying the Wrong Thing: Improving Learning with Multimedia by Including Misconceptions, Misconception-Based Multimedia Instruction." Basically, saying misconceptions to help learning through multimedia, which is essentially videos. That's basically what his PhD was. Almost nothing to do with physics. There were physics questions in there, but most of it was, okay, I'm going to say something that you may think is incorrect. Again, going back to that meaning of a question. What is the meaning of the question? You could ask someone a question, they think it means something, they answer the question, and you can say, well, actually, no. That's potentially a misconception from either the misunderstanding of the question, the misunderstanding of the statement, or the assumptions people are making through what they already had in their minds. And this is part of like illusions, part of lazy thinking, and this is where he suggests using misconceptions at the start of a video. This is video specific at the moment, but he says use misconceptions at the beginning of the video to get people thinking. So they're using this, okay, you may think I mean this, so you answer this thing. So there are two meanings, A and B. You say something, and the initial assumption, the initial misconception and assumption is to answer A. The quick answer is A. Everyone gives an answer A, but actually the answer is B, because maybe there is a mental twist in there, and you've made an assumption somewhere, or you've made a little bit of a mistake in calculation somewhere, or you've just been lazy in thinking. There are loads of different ways to manipulate this, which you may have seen online. There are lots of optical illusions as well that don't do necessarily the same thing in the mind, but they still create this element of curiosity, like, why does that work? I don't understand this thing. There is an element of misconception, misunderstanding in what's going on, because you can look at something and then something disappears or something reappears, or you see something else, or someone else sees something else to you, and there's just like, what? That doesn't make sense. And it brings in intrigue. And what that does is it triggers your mind to start learning, because you're like, I want to know what's going on. And that is what they try and do. But again, when you think about it, that's non-linear, because there are different parts there are parts creating a whole, but they're all different, and different things will change. So the perception of what is going on will change. So there's interactivity in the different parts, because the different parts being the different areas of knowledge that you have. So when you see an illusion a second time, actually, you know the answer. So there's an element of learning that goes on that's non-linear, but it's still, most of the time, a linear answer, which is where they interact with one another. It's non-linear or it's linear. It can be both. Elements of both can be involved, which is why understanding both is, I think, is quite important in learning anyway. So misconceptions, using misconceptions in videos is great, but also using misconceptions or clarifying misconceptions in conversations. So when you are speaking about something to anyone, anywhere, make sure that if there is a misconception that you know that could be happening, make sure that is clarified or at least explained through. So, for example, the Feynman Technique is a video I recently did on my YouTube channel, and it's spoken about quite a lot. And there is a misconception in that the Feynman Technique is to do with Richard Feynman. It has nothing to do with Richard Feynman. It was just named after him. There is also a misconception that the Feynman Technique is really, really, really useful. It's actually not that useful as the Feynman Technique is defined traditionally, but there are elements of the Feynman Technique that are useful, such as the teaching through learning, like using teaching to learn. That's really useful. But using teaching, so trying to teach someone that has no understanding of the thing that you are learning about, isn't really going to help you get a deeper understanding, but it may help you be better at explaining something. So the Feynman Technique in that sense would be teaching them to do something else. And this is what I was talking earlier about constraints. Because you're teaching someone else, you could be teaching someone else that also knows what's going on, so that you can challenge each other, so you get a deeper level of understanding using this teaching method. Or you could be teaching someone that has no idea what's going on in the topic. So the challenge for you isn't your understanding of the topic, it's your ability to explain the topic, to teach the topic to someone else. Now, teaching and explaining something is not learning and knowing the thing. It's a skill in itself, because lots of people know stuff. Lots of people are experts in things. Lots of people have deep understandings of things, and they can't explain it. We have all experienced lecturers and professors that know their topic inside and out. They know everything about their topic. They know loads about their topic. They know more than we can even imagine about the topic. But they can't explain it at all, because the words that they would use to explain the topic go way beyond us. So it's not that they don't understand the topic. They understand it way beyond us. But their skill in learning, their skill in communication for that understanding isn't built up. So the Feynman Technique isn't teaching you how to learn, it isn't teaching you better understanding, it's teaching you how to teach, how to explain, which might be what you want to do, but it might be not what you want to do, unless you're trying to teach it to someone else that can challenge you, in which case now you're not doing the Feynman Technique traditionally, you're doing something else. So misconceptions, understanding what is actually going on and explaining those things when you are going through this conversation. So if you were talking with someone, I use the Feynman Technique. Or do you use the Feynman Technique in a traditional sense? Or do you use the Feynman Technique in a teaching sense? In which case, let's try and work out what you're actually doing actions-wise. Hopefully that makes sense and gives you an example. If you're a little bit lost, go onto my YouTube channel, and I did a video about the Feynman Technique. So have a look and explore that a little bit. That may give you a little bit of context. And then the final point that I have here is your brain. I will just read out the title of the video. Anil Seth, How Your Brain Invents Yourself. So, how your brain invents yourself. Essentially, Anil is a consciousness scientist. He researches what consciousness means. So when we are thinking, when we are seeing, when we are looking around, when we are experiencing the world, most of it is through our eyes. Obviously, blind people don't experience the world in the same way, but most of us use our eyes. But what that's basically doing is giving our brain information. And this is what all of our senses do. Our senses give our brain information. Our brain then interprets that information and creates this vision, this thing, this thought in our mind. Now, that is going to be different for absolutely everyone. People that are colorblind obviously see colors differently to us. The most obvious example. They will see, depending on what sort of colour blindness they are, they may see red as brown or brown as red and green and blue and confuse the colours up. I'm not colourblind, so I don't know what colours they can get confused. My dad's colourblind. But yeah, and you can get confused like that. And the world that they see, the world that they experience is different because of the inferences and the perceptions and the predictions that they have made. And the note I have here is the brain is tracking our best guesses to create what we think the world is. So our brain is making loads and loads of predictions about what we think the world is, and that is what we are generating. An example that I've used recently in the Notion Nerds podcast is the analogy of a cup. When you see a cup, I don't have a cup near me, but when you see a cup, you're seeing one side of it. If you hold it up to your face, you see one side of it. But your brain predicts what the other side of the cup is going to look like through prior experiences. Maybe you've seen the cup before, and you know what the other side of the cup looks like. Maybe there is a message on the side of the cup. You hold it up one side, you can't see the message. You spin it around, you can see the other message. But your brain, because of prior experiences, can predict what the other side of the cup says. Maybe when you look at a wall and you know what's behind the wall, your brain can predict roughly what's behind the wall. If you're in your house and you look through a door that's shut, you know what's on the other side of the door if you've been in the room before, so your brain can predict what's going on. If you haven't been in there before, there are so many different things that your brain can predict, but what it predicts are things that are likely that you have seen before. So your experience of the world, your experience of yourself are prior experiences, prior beliefs, which means when we're going forwards into the future, we can't really predict anything that we haven't already seen, because we haven't seen it, so we can't predict it, which makes creativity very interesting as a topic to explore when it comes to learning, because, okay, how do I do this? Well, creativity is putting things you've seen before together to create something new. That's what creativity is. It's using things that we've already seen before to create something new in a context, in an environment, and a different way of thinking, which requires challenging different contexts, asking questions of basic assumptions, essentially, and that's obviously what Einstein does. And the reason this is interesting, I'm going to relate this all the way back to the environments that we create around learning, which is essentially what this podcast episode's been about. Is we have constraints, we have affordances, we have linear pedagogy, we have non-linear pedagogy, and we have psychological safety. All of those elements, and communication, all of those elements build up a learning environment. And that learning environment can be online, it can be offline, it can be a communication, it can be a one-way communication. There are loads of different ways a learning environment can be created. But for anyone to thrive in a learning environment, there needs to be elements of all of these things in there which support prior beliefs in what their experience of learning is. Otherwise, people will just leave, just go, disappear, and won't bother learning. So how do we do that in schools? How do we do that online? How do we do that in MOOCs and online courses? That's going to depend on the context. It's going to depend on the environment, of course. But what we need to try and do is make an environment that is psychologically safe, that acknowledges that there are constraints and affordances to each context, acknowledge that there are linear processes in learning and non-linear processes in learning, depending on what you're trying to teach, what is trying to be learnt, and then recognize that prior beliefs are going to impact whatever it is that you're teaching, whatever it is that you're talking about, and all the conversations. So when you are looking at a comment online or something, just acknowledge, actually, what do they mean? What are they trying to say? Or, and this is what I try and do when people say something, how would I try and answer the question that they have answered? And then would we come to the same conclusion? Lots of interesting questions in there, lots of things to explore. But thank you for listening, and I will see you all, well, you can hear me all next week, or you'll see me on YouTube. Bye, everyone.